Now recording. Welcome to Module 3. The fun thing about these particular chapters, Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, is that I wasn't kidding in the prologue in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 that like the hardest thing is about being responsible for yourself, right? And I don't know about you, but there's a lot of kicking and screaming involved in trying to be responsible for yourself, where you're like, no, I want to focus on the other people or somebody outside of me or somebody who's far worse than me. And that's hard, and we're still at the beginning. So what I'm trying to do is help all of us, including myself, figure out how did I end up this way and what is this way. So who and how am I in all of my relationships? That is the greatest of the dismantling of the systems, is that instead of it being external and additive, I'm asking you to flip yourself inside out and figure out how you got here, right? My general premise is your life has taught you how to be, and you're pretty convinced how to be based on what you've learned from your life, because it makes you feel safe and prepared. But that's like the ultimate foundation layer. And then we engage with someone else. I deeply believe that the somebody else has also experienced their life teaching them how to be, and that how their life has taught them to be has made them feel safe and prepared. So I'm showing up this way and they're showing up this way, and now we're going to try and connect. Then layer in social identities, power, privilege, dominant, subordinated identities, the experience of being marginalized or silenced or harmed or suffering or pain or triggered, etc. It's amazing that we get anything done. But if we can roll it back to who and how are we and how did we get here, I think that is the foundation that will move us forward in a way that's different than just like Jedi skills or manipulative communication skills to get your way, but to actually lead to better and more consistent conversations and connections with other people. So that's kind of the premise, and it's a lot. But remember the section title, enough. This is not perfect. This is not immediately 100% congruent in all ways. This doesn't even have to be alphabetized. This is like the pile of laundry or to-do items that's in the back of a closet you don't even open. That's okay, but that's where we're going to kind of play a little bit today. So those of you that did read through the chapter 3 and 4, what are some of kind of your overall thoughts or comments about how that process even went? Were you kicking and screaming from, during, or in the middle of the process at all? Or are you some kind of personal masochist and just loved it?
I know I'm usually the one that jumps in first, but I have to admit, I didn't get the reading done. So I'll let someone else talk about how that went for them.
That's okay.
So what I noticed, I think it's always good to self-reflect, especially when it comes to the heart, action, and head. What I kept coming back to, because a lot of parts in the chapters asked what we are, and I kept thinking of different situations and different relationships that I have, of how they intertwine, and how I'm action in some and heart in some, and but so that was one of my comments. Another comment was when it comes back to self-reflection, I think that's definitely the hardest thing to do. Mm-hmm. And you talked a couple times about listening and not responding right away, and I think that's also a hard thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Especially with action-y stuff, right? Like,
yes.
And well, actually, no, I take it back. It's hard to not respond without being reflective from an action place. I mean, I said that because that's me, right? But you can also be like, whoa, 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 whoa. What are you talking about? That's not the idea I had in mind at all, which could be hardy. And you could also immediately respond from like a very detailed place of like, I said 7, right? Like, no. They were wearing a yellow sweater. Like, okay, great. But that like immediate thing is without that reflection bit. That's awesome. Great. Anything else? Anybody else want to just say kind of overall how self-reflection even shows up in their life? Um,
Well, that I can talk about.
Great.
I feel like I live in self-reflection. I'm always thinking about why I do what I do. Even I haven't worn makeup, I think, since we've been home in March. And I went through this whole like, why do I wear makeup to work? Is it important? Am I trying to impress somebody? Does it make me feel better? Do I just buy it because somebody advertised it to me and told me that this is what women do? All of those things I'm always processing on how, and I actually believe we train others how to interact with us by how we respond to them. And I'm always thinking about, okay, if I'm in an interaction that I know could be potentially be volatile, like how can I come to that calm and not jump into things so that it doesn't automatically go there.
Great. And that's noticing the patterns of behavior and then trying to decide what it is you're going to do about them, right? Like that's literally the beginning of being responsible for who and how you are. Cool. So Jamie, I know you just got here. So I added a Word document into the chat that have the 7 discussion questions from module 3, just in case those weren't accessed through Canvas, so that you have kind of what questions we're talking about.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I apologize for coming late. My boss had to hop on an urgent call with her. So
bosses.
I know. What can you do?
If I remember correctly, you feel very supported by your boss, and that's great. And probably is informed by you being able to jump on calls. Good job. So what kind of judgments and assumptions do you make so that you do feel safe and prepared? What kind of patterns, if anything, came up? Or even when I asked that right now, if you've done no prep work, what kind of judgments and assumptions do you make so that you can feel safe and prepared?
Well, I mean, obviously I make the judgment and assumption that I'm always right.
Well, that is a good place.
Problem. And that takes a lot of convincing then after the fact, because for everyone, because I'm not always right, which I think then kicks in the self-reflection for sure about that whole age-old question, is it better to be right or I forget the other part of it. I guess I get stuck in that right part, but that generally is that is a pattern of behavior I've noticed in myself that I need to change how I'm interacting with other people.
And I would throw out, so when we start talking about change, we are not talking about Windexing and reformatting, right? Like you've noticed it now, so it's already changed because now you're noticing when it's happening, right? And whoever you're engaging with, there's a very good chance they are engaging with you also with the assumption that they are starting at right. You also know people who start at I'm wrong, right? Like, I don't know how to do this. And you have to be like, no, of course you do. Like, this is how it's going to be okay. Like, so that is a very important thing to kind of notice about yourself. You don't have to like never do it again, right? Like it makes you feel safe and prepared. But why does it make you feel safe and prepared? And what does that do before the connections even started? Because you're entering from that particular place, right? And Heidi, you kind of touched on this too, but in the concept of differently right, which is not moral relativism, right? Like I'm not saying that like everyone is right now as they're talking about those that are talking about politics or the presidential election or something like that. I deeply believe there are wrong people that exist. So I just want to put that out there. So I have one sense of morality that I believe should be shared, notice modal verb, should be shared across humanity. But the concept of differently right gives that space for the other person's life has taught them that this is how you're supposed to show up. They're probably also showing up pretty convinced that they're correct, right? Now, for 5 seconds, can I hold them in a differently right place so that I can engage with them instead of just like trying to reformat them or Windex all their wrong parts? But like, how can I do that? So what were some of y'all's initial thoughts or the impact of the concept of differently right?
I like asking clarifying questions to make sure that you understand correctly. That's something I can definitely work on. Just a lot of times people say things and the person they're saying it to understands it completely different.
Sarah,
So
your
to ask,
sound is going in and out kind of intermittently, just so you know.
not any better? Hold on. Somebody else talk.
Okay. Any other thoughts about differently right? I know, Brian, on a high level, we were talking about a situation that was happening in your life after the last call, where somebody had a different perspective or a different impact of something. So we started talking about how your identities may be experiencing this, and then the possibilities of how their identities may be experiencing this, and then the possibilities of how the other person's identities would experience a response, right? So
Mhm.
that's also being self-reflective in a way. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think also just an important addition to that scenario was that, because my initial thought about differently right goes to culture, right? So I think that what is culturally normative for me may be different for Alexandra. So her cultural norms, maybe what she was taught, might be different than what I was taught. And so that's how we can be differently right, because what we're doing is, this is right for me in my cultural group, and that's right for her in her cultural group. But oftentimes we kind of walk into the room and forget that we may represent different cultural groups, right? And so we assume we're playing the game by the same rules, but we actually have a different set of rules. So that's the first thing I thought of.
Mm-hmm.
And then an additional thought that I had about our conversation last week was that I also recognized that I felt as though that I shared a cultural group with this other person. So imagine if I can recognize that Alexandra and I have different cultural backgrounds just because we're individuals.
Mm-hmm.
If I feel like that Alexandra and I also share a cultural background together, it's kind of an aha moment to realize that we still may experience that shared culture differently.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that. It used to be that's how I join Alexandra, is to say, but we're both this,
right,
and realize that that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing.
Well, and what I think is important to add to that is that we're both vegetarians, but how we are both vegetarians could still be very different.
Mm-hmm.
But you can also be a vegetarian that is also lactose intolerant, which is going to be a very different vegetarian experience for someone who isn't. Right.
Yeah.
So the I'm obviously didn't eat breakfast because I'm hungry, but the intersectionality of multiple identities impacts the shared identity. And it is also true that the one identity we have in common, we could still be experiencing wildly differently, right? Like, as a good old sociology major, my brother and I had parents and we lived in the same house, and my parents did not get divorced. And like, it was, the Brady Bunch, except just 4 people, right? But he and I ended up very, very differently in a lot of ways. And if I take the time to like see past where he's obviously wrong, we also have a very strong work ethic, a strong sense of humor. Like there is something that is very similar that came out of the product of being raised the way we were in that shared experience that also resulted in very different ways of looking at things. Fascinating. No, again, notice no judgment value. I mean, he's wrong, but like other than that, no judgment value. And these are things to kind of notice, right? What about the crucible moments for those that were kind of playing along? I use the concept of crucible moments. The example that I like to use is that if your life was going to be made into a movie, these would be the scenes that would definitely need footage. They may not make the final movie, like they might get edited, but you would need to shoot these scenes of your life.
You COVID.
Sorry.
What is interesting is, I love that TikTok actually. What is interesting, I think, about how crucible moments work when I do this like in person in an activity is we all go to Pain and Suffering Olympics. So all the crucible moments we come up with are all the negative, horrible things that have happened to us that we have survived. Look at us. But crucible moments are also, I've never birthed a child, but everybody I know who's been there at the birthing of a child, that has become a crucible moment. A positive one generally, right? So positive crucible moments, negative crucible moments. How was it for those of you that did the activity? How was it kind of naming those? Possibly not even in chronological order, right? But they just kind of popped up and fed in and led into the next ones. And then how are those examples positive or negative at the time? Or how have they become now with more time? Just out of curiosity.
So I think for me, like moving, sorry, did I freeze for a second? I think for me, moving away by myself and where I didn't know anybody and everything, like that was a really big, almost negative moment for me at that moment. But looking back on it, I'm like, yes, that was the right decision. That was everything. But I remember like leaving my boyfriend at the time, who's now my husband, was like devastating to me. And there were tears upon tears or whatever. And I'm like, yep, that was hard, but it was the right decision. So I think that is definitely a defining moment in my personal growth that I saw negatively then. And now I'm like, yeah, that was the right decision, you know?
Mhm. Great. Other kind of positive or negative crucible moments that showed up for you? That
Me?
I can share one. So how I even got to my current position at Anschutz in the Department of Surgery with everyone is a very fun story. I was dating somebody while I was unemployed last year, and through him, I had a contact in who knew of the position in my team. He told me about it, and then the next day broke up with me. So I went through a breakup and actually applied to this job sort of spitefully because I'm like, well, I don't want what you gave me, but I guess. And lo and behold, it has turned out to be one of the best positions I've ever had, put me on one of the best teams I've ever interacted with. So for me, it was a very negative situation at the time, but it turned into one of the most positive experiences of my life. And it's weird kind of reconciling the two to know I had to go through this to get what I have now.
Mhm. Yeah, very interesting. So it is interesting that the two that are shared, and I'm sure others have come up too, we tend to think the negative ones first. And my husband always says that I tell stories from places of strength instead of vulnerability. And it's kind of interesting to me because I feel like I share and disclose out of vulnerability, but that I like persevered and survived, etc. But he hears them as, look at me, I am resilient, like, so it's a very interesting kind of exchange. So when coming up with this kind of structure of the book, I did notice that the first, I did all these activities ad nauseum and then like boiled them down for someone to be able to do like in a lunch break. And I probably came up with 600-700 crucible moments. And then I categorized them all in a spreadsheet, of course. And in categorizing them all in a spreadsheet, of course, 600 were negative things that I now can identify the positive that came out of them. And of the 100 that were left or so, I think probably a dozen were positive things that stayed positive. So then now we're down to like, what is 75, 78, depending on the math, that is left of nebulous ones that were kind of just filler. And when I looked at what they were, it was me trying to come up with like what would make a better movie. And then I was also trying to fill in the chronology, right? Like I noticed I kind of skipped middle school. Don't we all wish we could? So then I'm like, okay, what's something important that happened in 6th grade? Then that's how that one came up, right? So that's not really a crucible moment unless it was, and I purposely am trying not to think of it. I have a shrink, but like that in itself was really fascinating, right? So now if you have and I think Sarah was kind of talking about this, about the emotional intelligence required to kind of bounce back and forth and employ what is needed. And when you add all your crucible moments together, your life has taught you how to show up at first, which is almost always with one or two of those variables in this, whatever this given context is. But your third rail has also been informed by these life experiences. for some, like when Alexandra, you're talking about growth patterns, or Jamie, you're talking about like this amazing thing came out of this negative thing. What is interesting is that when you map out your crucible moments, it can also kind of cement which of the three variables you tap into the most when you're not feeling confident, or when you're feeling like incapable or insecure, or at like smaller and lower. And it will also reveal the pattern of when that one gets fueled correctly, you can then kind of become unstoppable. You can grow in a way that you would never have imagined possible. That was a really fascinating piece for me when I was kind of doing my own research on myself, but then listening to all my audience members and participants to come up with that pattern, which is where the third rail comes from, right? Is that it's not something you ignore. It is with you all the time, and it is either holding you back or it is somehow propelling you forward, which is that gas pedal kind of idea. How does that resonate? How did your third rail show up for you?
Can you hear me better?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. I don't know. My computer is not good. And again, I think it goes back to what situation and who you're interacting about that third rail, at least for me. I think my third rail is different with my kids than it is with my husband, than it is with my mom, than it is with my coworkers at work.
Sure.
And I think my strongest attribute, or whatever you call it, pretty much stays the same. I think it's the last two that switch a lot. So I don't know how to really think about that, but I think that third rail, at least for me, just is interchangeable a lot with my second rail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also think it's important because the third rail is a numeric value stacked. The numeric value of first or second rail really becomes almost unimportant, right? It's not whether you are head action or action head. Nobody cares, because in the moment you show up the way that you show up, but it's that dangling piece. And I called it the third rail literally because of the subway system, right? So it is the thing you can't touch because it'll electrify you, but it is also the thing that powers the entire subway system. It's a critical part of the subway system. So whether you're talking about rail 1 or rail 2 that the train is on, it doesn't mean anything without the third rail. So they all work together, right? What about the difference between feeling unsafe versus uncomfortable? I hear this a lot in conversations of like, oh, I don't feel safe here. But like really what you mean is that you don't feel prepared to be uncomfortable in the space, versus like actually your well-being is threatened, which is also real, but is very hard to hold in a way that is felt and taken seriously when you also have to deal with, I feel unprepared to be uncomfortable, which is very different than unsafe. How does this show up in your work? How do you see discomfort showing up in your work? Is it kind of a justification of some sort? How does feeling unsafe show up in your life?
I think about this all the time, unsafe versus uncomfortable. And I think what I want to add to the conversation is I have become aware, or I wonder, and I believe this to be true, that when I feel uncomfortable or even sometimes unsafe, I find myself wondering how much of that is due to privilege. So in other words, do I just feel entitled to comfort? And so when someone, so my identity as a cis man, for instance, usually, with all the privilege that comes with that, nothing really crops up. But then every once in a while, this weird sort of thing will come up that will sort of make me uncomfortable and or frustrated, or, Yeah, that's don't call me a rapist. I'm not a rapist. You can't say all men are rapists. I never said all men are rapists. I said that men rape. And I think, and I'm aware of some, for lack of another way of describing it, entitlement on my part that might be related to my privileged identities, which leads me to feel like I'm not safe. I feel safe, or I feel attacked in this scenario because I'm a man or because of my privilege.
And I would throw in that there are also, back to intersectionality, is that your identities exist simultaneously. And so I think there are times where people do legitimately feel unsafe from a subordinated, marginalized identity, like, I am in trouble right now. And I will dismiss it as I am feeling privileged and entitled because I've done enough self-reflection or social justice work that I'll just focus on my privileged identities, which then doesn't allow the lack of safety to be manifested in a real way, right? That is a problem, but it is also a problem to say that you are uncomfortable because rooted in privilege and entitlement. Brian, you articulated that perfectly. And then call it lack of safety because you and the same entity have known what those feelings feel like. So you can say that this is what that feels like, but you didn't acknowledge this feeling. You're pretending it's this feeling, which really means that you're still not really being self-reflective, but you're also not taking care of yourself. And you're also giving yourself room to feel entitled to not have to take care of yourself, which I think at the root is why when we do self-reflection work, we're like, no, let's talk about other people first, because you have to realize that you're often doing that. It's really hard to take care of yourself when we live in a culture that you're not encouraged to take care of yourself because you really aren't valued. That particular aspect of you is not valued in a similar way as other aspects of you or other people. And from that real lack of safety place, you're trying to literally live, like base level, foundational level, trying to live. And there are other folks who have not done any self-reflection to even acknowledge if they do have a subordinated or marginalized identity, because they just have so much power and privilege they don't have to, right? Like there's a conference that I have gone to that one of the things you have to do is name a subordinated or marginalized group. And inevitably, it is always a heterosexual, educated, white man, cis man, who has to be like, I don't know that I have one. And then they have to sit in this place of like, what it means to feel guilty or ashamed to not even be able to think of one, which literally means that they maybe have been displacing other people naming theirs and not listening to it because they couldn't relate to it. Does that make sense? Even if you come up with nothing, you can still do the self-reflection work and try to relate to what that is. And doing that work before you need it done lessens that shame or guilt or sense of I got to fix this about other people, and you can hold it yourself. What are other thoughts or comments about that? It's a lot to unpack. Heidi, it looks like you're trying to say something, but you're muted.
I am talking to myself, just reiterating, yeah, it's a lot. I mean, the self-reflection is hard. It's hard work. And taking the time, I mean, just listening to what you're saying, I don't know that I'm taking the time to do the appropriate self-reflection, but I don't know that I would necessarily have recognized that. I feel like I try to be a very accountable individual, specifically to my actions. So it's a lot. Everything you're saying is a lot. More work to be done.
What is the section title? Perfect and always, right? Perfect always, all the time. Must do this. Perfect always, all the time, right? Like, what? So as soon as you start uncovering and you're like, wait a minute, I really thought I was doing a good job. What ends up happening is perfect always, all the time shows up. And then you're just a complete failure, Heidi, obviously. What
it's
kind
of unraveling, right? I mean, we have to go through this personification of who we've tried to be for so long and the training behind all of that and the work put into it. And I mean, that just goes back to the whole title, right? good enough and good enough now. So there's a lot of unpacking behind that.
Yeah. So I just want to encourage you're not a horrible, terrible person.
Thanks.
For the record, you'll get a
You
certificate.
guys hear that?
You're not a horrible, terrible person. And occasionally, some of the time with what you already have, you can try. Right? Like, oh, okay. So notice we're like more than 100 pages in trying to get people to a place of like, all right, I'm going to lean into this thing. What I'm going to do is every once in a while, I'm going to be thoughtful about who and how I am. Right? Like, great. What a wonderful starting place. But it took 180 some odd pages to get okay with recognizing that we don't do this. I wrote the damn book and I don't do this. I certainly don't do it 100% of the time. But isn't this radically different than gathering vocabulary lists and assuming that's going to solve the problem? Right? Like, that's a possibility. Sarah, were you going to say something because your phone was up?
I was just going to say, can you educate me real quick and just tell me what cis means?
Oh, sure. So this is why I get invited to parties. So cis, C-I-S, is the Latin prefix that means congruent. So like how I was labeled at birth, how I identify once I have a sense of agency, my gender identity specifically is congruent. So I was a little girl. I was raised as a little girl. I turned into a woman at some point in time. I agreed with that. So I'm not trans. I'm not gender nonconforming. I am cis or a cis woman or have cis privilege.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Ask any kind of Latin-based questions as much as you like. Get your money's worth. All right. So now let's switch to our stories. So if we are responsible for the accuracy of our stories, which right there is a lot of therapy, right? Because you're like, have you met my mom? Because I don't know. Have you met my mother? Let's just go with the baseline assumption that we are responsible for the stories that we are writing right now in this moment moving forward. Okay. Maybe she was totally responsible up until this point. But if we are going to be responsible for the accuracy of the stories, when have you left room for edits of someone else's truth? So I talk about how like we write these stories so that we're about to engage in a scenario or with a person so that we feel safe and prepared so we know how to show up. And the premise is, one, you're responsible for the stories you write. But two is they might not be accurate, but they make you feel safe and prepared. So then you print that story triple space with extra wide margins and curiously, generously, vulnerably, authentically request edits to the story that you have written. So when have you left room for edits for somebody? And have you done it to yourself? You only do it for other people? Why is leaving room for edits such hard work?
I think that a lot.
Oh, we'll go Alexandra and then we'll go Sarah.
I think that to me right now, my mind is so political based right now. Like I had dinner with a friend the other day and we've never talked about politics ever because I always thought she was one way and I was the other way. And then we kind of talked about it and I was like, wait, I had this preconceived notion that she was a certain way and we couldn't discuss and we couldn't whatever. And then there was all of this editing that I had done for myself that wasn't accurate. You know what I mean? And so I don't know. It's just you do assume and to make myself not uncomfortable, I would never bring it up with her. And not that if you're different political views, you can't be friends or whatever, but I don't know, to make myself not uncomfortable, I would never bring it up, even though I say we could have differing views and still be friends. But I didn't want to put myself in that position. So I had already had these preconceived assumptions and judgments. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? Round in circles there a bit, but.
No, it's great. Sarah, you were going to add something too. Thanks, Alexandra.
Yeah, I was just going to add, so I have a really good friend and she's extremely educated. She's a doctor and we go over to her house all the time. She's one of our really good friends. And she's a basically borderline hoarder, which for me, if I don't use it, get it out of my house all the time. So it was very difficult for years for me to kind of look past it and step over things. And like I have visions of in my head of what I can do to her house and stuff like that. So I created a story in my head of like, wow, she's truly a hoarder. And then just recently she opened up to me and told me about how poor she was growing up and how it was hard for her to buy anything and get any material things. And so it started to edit my story about her and understand more of her actions of today based on her past history. I think there's something in the book about that Steve Jobs said about like connecting the dots of your past. You have to look at your past to connect the dots, not the future. And that resonated with me because I was like, oh my gosh, that's very interesting. And I think it's easier to edit stories of somebody else than to edit your own story, especially if you're constantly self-reflecting, and then it's kind of editing your own story all the time. But I think it's harder to edit your own story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think one of the COVID reaction has now lasted long enough that if we're going to manifest some kind of good out of this particular experience, it's noticing that we have removed all distractions from not editing your own behaviors or your own stories, right? So like if it was on a to-do list before March 6th and it's still not done, you're not doing it. Like that is a clear object, like that's not going to occur, right? And very early on in this process, when I was very nervous about being an extrovert, sheltering in place in a teeny tiny town, similar to the job thing that you were talking about, I was dating my husband at the time. I assumed we'd break up soon. And he applied for this job in this very rural part of Northern California. And I was like, I'm never going to live there, but he would love it, right? So like I told him all about it, sold him on it, etc. And the day after I got hired at the job in Tucson, actually, is when he got the job here. And I was like, well, see you later. Have a good time. And the whole time I was in Tucson, I ended up like desperately missing him. And then I quit my job and moved out here, right? So now I'm sheltering in place with one human being in a teeny tiny town. What am I thinking? Oh my God, what am I going to do? So when this became like, oh, it might be longer than a week. Remember back then when you thought like it might be a week? I was like, what are we going to do? How are we going to get people? Who's going to be in our pod? Like, I'm going to need to mix it up and not just be you, no offense. And his knee-jerk worry was, are we going to run out of food? And I was like, what are you talking about? We have plenty of food. And so like, I do the grocery shopping. That's one of the roles that I do. And I had to show him like where food is stored. And we are almost November now. And whatever it is we have wanted to eat, I have been able to make that meal. So I haven't even like, well, I guess we're just going to eat pickles and sauerkraut for dinner because it's the only food we have. We haven't gotten to that place. But it was so shocking to me that food is where he immediately got worried. Like, what are you talking about, right? You don't even eat. Like, you have no relationship to food. And then, similar to use the word you were using, is the unraveling. He was raised significantly poorer than me. His father died when he was 11, and his mom did not, I think you would say, did not handle that well. So even though he was on the swim team, he ate like 8 or 9 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches a day for 15 years, right? And would like sneak orange juices from the fridge for her screwdrivers. Like that is how food showed up for him. That is never how, like I had a deep freeze where you bought a cow every year and my family went hunting and we have always had food. This has never been an issue. So then inside of like, how are we going to respond to sheltering in place and quarantine? That immediately triggered for him and that immediately triggered for me. And then we were able to have a conversation about how that shows up in our relationship, not just what we're going to eat for dinner and when do I get to see another living human. So it's a good, I think it's an excellent test of, can we do this now and see what has shown up now? So Shelly, even you were talking about like, why do I wear makeup? Is somebody telling me to do this? What is going on? This is what my face looks like. What? People know what my face looks like. I now have this face with eyeliner on. They're aware I'm wearing eyeliner. What is happening? But we can do that now. And that could be something really positive that comes out of all this. Fingers crossed. And I'm wearing rosy glasses. So also when doing these activities, and this kind of gets to what Brian was talking about too, I noticed a connection. It does not happen all the time, but it is almost stifling when I bring this up in conversations. But when people are responding across intent versus impact, right? So it comes up a lot in diversity, equity, inclusion work, is that my intention and your impact, whatever. So I have the premise that I am 100% responsible for all of the impact, even if I don't know about it. That is a big assumption on my part, but it's radically different than everything else I've read. So what if I'm 100% responsible? Even if I didn't mean it, but I could still enter the opportunity of being 100% responsible. What is fascinating is that when people disagree with that and they're like, no, that's just wrong. Let me tell you an example. When their wrongness comes from like a defensive, possibly detail oriented, like, let me tell you, there's a lot of this happening. It is almost always being fueled from a dominant or privileged identity, which roots kind of, I think, in that entitlement of not ever being told you are wrong, not ever being told that your intention landed incongruently. It's almost always fired from your dominant places. When you are responding in a like painful, suffering, possibly historical pain, possibly pain with this person, possibly pain in this moment, those things are almost always fueled by your subordinated or marginalized identities. So depending on how you are showing up to a given miscommunication, in this case, where an intention and impact was incongruent, or even intervening as a third party, a bystander, how you enter that place is where your subordinated, marginalized, painful experiences show up, and where your entitlement shows up from your dominant or privileged identities. Both of those could happen. No judgment, but isn't that a fascinating worksheet? So I'm curious, did you all see or do you sense any patterns? Is there a connection between your intentions, knowledgeable, conscious or unconscious intentions, and your sense of entitlement? Or is there, do you also see a connection potentially from impact and its connection to subordinated or marginalized identities?
So I'm going to speak from my privileged identities again. And I just, as you were talking, Jessica, I just remember this moment with my mother. We all probably have complicated relationships with our mothers. But one time we were having some sort of conversation and I was trying to explain something. I mean, kind of like what I do all the time at work, right? In my role as an educator, you know, I take, you know, trying to explain my privilege or trying to explain, I mean, it was something, I don't even remember what it was, but I was trying to explain it and she was listening and she was like, yeah. And so at some point in the conversation, she stopped me and she said, Brian, it's not that I don't understand you. It's just that I disagree with you. And I was like, what? And she said, you have said the same thing to me like 4 times. And all you've done is just change the way you're saying it. And that was this aha moment for me because I realized that to me, what was a truth or what was apparent was so truthful for me that I didn't stop for a second to think that she disagreed. I just assumed she didn't understand. So if I just choose different words, she'll understand. And then she'll go, oh, now I get it. Thank you. And she finally said, please shut up because I don't agree with you. And nothing you're going to say is going to change my mind. And I was like, what do you mean? And it was just this moment of, whoa, how often do I do that? Where, you know, if someone doesn't agree with me, I immediately try to describe it differently because I'm not cognizant of the fact that I am trying to maybe push my truth on them.
Mm-hmm. And to edit the word push my truth so that we don't get into a moral relativist kind of place, you're pushing your rightness, right? And the person is disagreeing with your rightness, which is, for me, was very helpful in separating the truth from I'm right. Are you really? But there's probably information I don't know, so I'm just pretty convinced I'm right. Because again, I'm entering, going back to Heidi, I am starting off with I am right. All right, well, what if I asked questions I don't know the answers to? But the biggest pushback I get to that is that, well, I'd have to start off wrong. No, this is not a dichotomy. You don't know the answer. You cannot be wrong about something you do not know. You are asking a question out of curiosity. Now you're listening. And then if you're listening, then you can hear disagreement instead of what I think would get dismissed as like mansplaining or something, like I wrote a comment today. Somebody challenged me on something, and of course they're an idiot. And so my response to them was actually, no. And I'm like, oh my God, I am mansplaining, right? Because this person is making an assumption and I read their assumption in this thing of like, that's how I read it. So I'm responding right back at them because they're wrong and I'm right. Yeah, I should probably reread this chapter. Other thoughts? If you've done the excavating, does taking responsibility of who and how you are make a little bit more sense in that it's not a destination, it is the excavating that is the responsibility? I'm seeing some noddings. Heidi, were you going to say something? You leaned forward. Pesky body language.
Just the hard work. It's hard work, and taking that accountability with the self-reflection. It's all of this is so thought-provoking, and it's a lot to think about every interaction. Having enough real actualization or realization of who you're presenting and how that's presenting out, and the impact that it's having on others. I think that whole part about the platinum rule, I've been thinking about the platinum rule a lot, and all the training we do around, if you have a message that you want heard, don't present it the way you understand it, but understand the audience you're presenting to so that it's going to be received the way you want it to be received. And I know that's not the platinum rule, but kind of in that whole general sense, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I'm recognizing throughout all of this, there's more work to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just in case, the platinum rule is Tony Alessandra's work, which builds off of the golden rule. And the golden rule is be nice, right? Treat others the way you want to be treated. That sounds amazing, except not everybody wants to be treated the way I want to be treated. Right. And I can dig my heels in more and be like, what? I did what I would expect. So now I'm just entering from a right place again. Whereas the platinum rule is, I have no idea what you would like. What would that be? Oh, I will do that then. Or I will not do that. But now I at least know if I am or am not doing that thing, right? So I use the example of pizza toppings, I think in the first video that we did over lunch. So like if Shelly and Shelly, I'd like to go to lunch with you. So I've already ordered an extra large pizza with extra green olives because that's my favorite pizza. Like,
great. I'll choke it down because you were polite enough to invite me to lunch.
Right. So I think I'm being nice and she's choking on lunch, right? So that's not actually a good thing, but we do it all the time and we chalk it up as a good thing because I thought it was nice. Well, thank you very much, party of one. Could you involve the other people that are having to choke down green olive pizza, right? Like, what if you don't even want pizza? That's the platinum rule, is that actual, the strength and vulnerability it would take to actually engage across the unknown and see if you are interested, right? Speaking of that unknown, and last question is take space. The concept of taking space often is a negative thing. So like Brian, as the only man who's been in these conversations, you often say like, I don't want to take up too much space. I'm putting my voice out here. That you use language that's very conscious. Maybe you know this, maybe you don't know this, maybe you need my feedback, maybe you don't, but you use a lot of language of like, this is what I think would contribute to this conversation. So I interpret you like wanting to say 1,000 things, but you are picking this one because maybe it will be constructive, right? Okay, so in taking space, how does that show up that isn't a criticism? Like, as a woman, I feel like I am being encouraged to be a size 0. No, I don't want to be a size 0. I am actually super happy being a size 18 to 22, depending on what brand we are talking about, right? Like, I exist. So what would it mean to take space declaratively of yourself, not thinking about what you are taking or resourcing away from others, but this is just you. This is your self-work. What would it mean for you to take space? How does that mean for you in your own notice, in your own self-reflective work, for you to exist in your own self-reflective work? What would that mean for you?
So for me, I think about this in terms of being a person who, as a child, was always told that I was too emotional. And so I always kind of compacted my emotions down for the benefit of other people. And I've worked in my adult life to, make that space for those, because I think sometimes when you're so used to compacting yourself down, whether it's emotionally, physically, either way, I think sometimes the way you swing from going to compact is you go like the opposite way sometimes before you kind of hit the nice middle balance ground of like, my emotions deserve space. But I think there was a time where maybe because I had tried to regulate these for so long that my emotions like overcompensated and ended up taking space because I felt they were important, but it ended up taking from other people.
Mhm.
And so the importance of taking space is recognizing that you deserve space. These things about you deserve space. But as a compensation method, don't take up so much space that it robs somebody else of theirs, I think is the hard middle line to find of, I deserve space and so do you. I'm not going to eat yours up so I can create mine, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I also think that it does make sense. I also think that it is interesting that the very tools often cited in diversity, social justice work are then self-weaponized. I mean, they're also weaponized out, but that's a different workshop, right? But they're self-weaponized of like, I need to make sure that everybody has a space to speak, so I won't speak, is very different than, if I don't speak, it will look like I'm not speaking, which is very different than I don't have anything to say and I don't have to speak and it will look like I'm not taking up room. So I'm not even going to think about what I would say, right? Like introverts are not speaking. Introverts are thinking and engaged in a conversation. They're just not leaking words out of their face. And an extrovert, as an external processing extrovert, there are times where words are coming out of my face that I'm not thinking about. Real self-reflective work is recognizing the difference there. So, other thoughts, comments, anything exciting?
Okay, again, as the man.
Was that? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Brian.
I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm going to take some space. So, but I think in reflecting on your question or what the question I was hearing, I'm thinking to myself, if I believe that as a man, I take up too much space and I am actively taking away from female identified folks. So I'm doing harm in taking up space. It becomes really difficult to take space, to allow myself to take space if I'm supposed to be aware. Like I'm a person who's self-reflective and aware of these kinds of things. And so I should create space. I'm also cognizant of the fact that sometimes if I sit back and choose not to speak, I have heard other people say, well, when the one man in the room is not talking, I feel like he's judging us and he's not participating in the same sort of way. And so then you're like, great, I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't.
Mm-hmm.
They're taking up too much space, or I'm sitting back, not taking up space, but judging. I lose either way.
Right. And I'm going to throw in, Brian, you're also a newish employee. So you have new perspective, right? You're also, from my lens, I don't know how anybody identifies, but from my lens, I would say is that you're one of the few voices of color in the conversation, right?
Mhm.
As a queer identified person, like you have subordinated and marginalized identities that also exist, right? And
Yes.
doing work from our dominant privileged identities is super important. I do not want you to stop doing that. But I also want you to notice that when we are not you, we also see those things talking as
Okay.
much as we could see these things not talking, right?
Well, I mind blown right now because I am just super aware in this moment as a man on this Zoom call. I do not think about myself as a person of color or as a queer person who should be taking space in those sorts of, who not should be, but could be taking space, or it may be important in the conversation to take space from those identities. And of course, I'm never one identity. It's an intersection of many. And yet I walk into the room, look at everybody's face and go, I see I see a room full of women.
Mhm.
I may be wrong about that and how people identify, but I see a room full of women. And so then my default space is be cognizant of your maleness.
Right.
The privilege that comes with that. And then I really think that ultimately I do it because I don't want to be judged by the women as a bad one.
Mhm.
And then I was just doing a workshop on redefining ally work, and I was reflecting on some of the why we choose to ally. So I would say I'm trying to be a good ally as a man to women, but I'm not doing it in the right way. My why is not altruistic. It's not social justice. It is about me. And so becoming aware of like, I need to do some work there.
Yeah, well, here's the bonus and a good segue to the next model. Number one, this is not a right or wrong situation. This is an is situation. Fun facts. What you are doing is both good work and self-preservation and shitty work and hard work, and you got more work to do. High five. Welcome to the team. So do the rest of us, right? And if we stay working at an external way, we are not doing the self-work. We can also navel gaze and do self-work forever so that we can get to perfect and do external work. This is not about perfect. This is about who you doing some of the time, right? Like that's it. That's all you got to do, right? So you're not right. You're not wrong. You are doing this. Isn't that interesting? That's the win, is that I am doing this. Okay. Alexandra.
And I think to go on to what Brian's saying is like, maybe there is a portion of yourself that says like you're doing it for different reasons, but I think that some of you wouldn't be doing it and standing up for women's rights and all of this if you didn't also, a portion of you wasn't just was for us and not just for you, and so that you felt better about yourself. You know what I mean? I think that there are so many facets to it, and don't beat yourself up because you think, oh, I'm doing it for me, but like you wouldn't be doing it for you if you weren't also doing it for me and for all the other women and all, you know what I mean? I don't know. I just think, and I think that what I'm learning from this conversation is that we choose not to take up space because we don't want to take up too much space for other people. We don't take up any space for ourselves because we feel like if we take up this much space for ourselves, now you can't take up that space for those other people aren't taking up space. I don't know. I'm not even articulating my words, but I think that we don't take up space for ourselves because we don't want to be seen like we're taking up too much space. And then meanwhile, we don't take up any space.
Can I throw in, have you guys seen the video where the guy puts big rocks like in a container and then pours sand in and it takes up? So I think in some regard, that's the space. I mean, there's infinite space available. I think it's okay for you to take the space that you need at the time in the space you're in.
And I think that's what I'm saying is that we're not taking up space because we think there are too many rocks, but like there's still enough room for, I haven't seen the video, but what I'm gathering is that like we think that we'll be a rock when really we could be sand and we could all coexist together. And so we choose not to even be sand because we think that other people will perceive us as being rocks.
Right. And they do, right? Like you are rocks to other people and you are sand to other people. And the premise of the video, good reach, Shelley. The premise of the video is that if you put sand in a jar first and then the gravel, there's no more room for the rocks. But if you put the rocks in first and then the gravel and then the sand, it can all fit in the same jar. And you have no control over how anybody perceives you. So like what you're trying, all of us, me included, what we are trying to do is dress up in the right armor so that we are perceived by other people the way we want to be perceived. And we call that listening. So the bonus is we're self-absorbed narcissists. Fantastic. Let's just do our own homework some of the time because it's better than ever. And it's not about the winning as much as it is like, oh, I did that thing again. How do I feel about doing that thing again? Still pretty good about it. All right. Okay. Well, that's probably annoying to someone. Yeah, I bet it is. Oh, look, Lucy's informing me that that thing I know now that I do is annoying. So maybe don't do it around Lucy, or maybe do it more around Lucy because I don't like her anyway. But I'm responsible for all of that. That is the work, not the fixing and the perfecting, but the like, oh, I'm doing that thing again. How fascinating. That's it. That is the work. So I appreciate all the nudges as we start to think about where this shows up with other people and what we're going to do next and now. That is, we're going to divide this next section of the book in half. So discussion number 4, module number 4 is the first half of now. And then number 5 will be the second half of now, which really gets to like, all right, so you just unpacked your closet. This is not necessarily the time to Marie Kondo yourself, but you are going to have to put everything back in the closet because you got guests coming. So you're going to have to figure out how to do that. So with that, I will see you in several weeks. Brian, you're muted.
We have been skipping, but we're actually meeting next week and the following. So we're going to meet 3 weeks in a row, and then the discussion piece will be over. So I don't want people to miss it thinking, oh, it's in 2 weeks.
Oh yeah, you're right. Next week. Can't keep up with all my Zooms. Go ahead.
I know, you've got too many, right? You got lots.
Alexandra, you're going to say something?
I just was saying thanks, guys, and thanks, Brian, for the video. I'm going to go watch that now.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.